Setbacks are temporary, but comebacks, they are legendary. Welcome back to the PSI Effect, where we pause, shift, and ignite purpose that speaks louder than your past. This is Nuge, and together with Frankie, we're your hosts in this space, and your comeback starts now.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the PSI Effect Podcast. I'm Nuge. I am here with Frankie. We are your host in this space. And man, do we have an episode for you today. We are going to be talking about some data collection. However, we are not going to be talking about what you get off of your desktop or your laptop. We're going to be digging into personal data collection. But before we get into that, we always talk about a few things. I usually pass it over to Frankie and let him tell us a couple things. But one thing that's just been on my mind to just kind of throw out there, I'd be curious to know what our audience thinks about this, what they've seen, and also you, Frankie. But I've been seeing a lot posted about this dynamic pricing that Walmart has ventured into, where the prices can just change automatically. And what they're saying is Walmart has the ability to change the prices based on how the customers feel about a particular item. And so, if like you and I have talked before about our snacks, talking about Doritos. And so if, 4 or 5 people go grab a bag of Doritos, the price can go up if that product has some popularity at a particular time of day. And that's kind of troubling to me. And, I don't know how true it is, but there's a lot circulating about that.
That gives me the willies. I mean, that seems to be capitalism at its finest. And I do mean that sarcastically. It's supply and demand, understandable, but for things to be pivoting on a dime, I'd be curious to see how quickly this dynamic pricing could be enacted. I have seen certain stores, I haven't seen them in a Walmart, but certain stores where they usually have the price tag listed right below where the item sits. It's a sticker or something like that. I have seen stores where that is a little LED digital display. So it's getting fed information over the network, kind of a little Internet of Things. And that would enable them to just on the fly be able to change the price and adjust it however they want to, and nobody would be any the wiser without having to go through and manually swap out the prices. But man, that's heavy. I mean, that would be good though if people started buying a whole lot of Doritos and double stuffed golden Oreos and drove the price up so much that my chunky butt would no longer want to go to Walmart and spend my hard-earned dollars on that kind of food.
That is a good point. However, my thought is this. So you go in there and you grab that bag of Doritos, and let's just say, I don't know, it's $2. And you're shopping around the store, and there's other people shopping, right? And then by the time you get to the register, that same bag of Doritos, because of the popularity, could be $2.50 or $3, at that point in time. So it's like, how do you, I don't know. It's just weird. It's scary. It's got too much of some previous movies and futuristic stuff that we've watched over the years.
That's very Big Brother, no trust type of stuff.
Absolutely, it's just bizarre. Well, anyway. Did you have anything you wanted to share, sir? I'm sorry, I just took over that whole moment that you normally share something with us.
Oh man. The main thing I want to share is, brother, this weather we have had is just roasting me. It is so hot around here. This past weekend, with the little thermometer on my deck that sits in the shade was reading 108, 110. Good Lord. Yeah. And I came home from work today before we started recording, and it's like, man, the house feels warm. I was like, I went and looked at my thermostat, and the big HVAC system is struggling to keep up and try to cool the house. And I'm fearful that the data I'm collecting is telling me that my HVAC system is about to fail.
Well, let's hope that's not the case, sir.
Whew. Yeah. But that's enough for me, though. That's enough for me. My HVAC woes, I know people have probably got a lot of them with this heat going on. But you, sir, you need to do a little bit of chatting yourself. I noticed you got some new content you've been pushing out there on social media, some journeys that you're going on yourself. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just have been on this health journey. You and I have talked about health in this space and talked about, habits and so forth, and how we arrive at a point to the goals that we have. And, one of the things I have been looking at is, my weight. And since I haven't been out working every day. My weight has gone up a little bit, and I say a little bit, tongue in cheek, but it's gone up a bit. And so I decided that I was going to take this journey, and I thought, what if I invited some folks to join the journey with me. And so that's kind of where it evolved. And the other part of it is because there's so much going on in social media and AI, and there's just so many new things to learn. And I've just been fascinated by the whole AI space and some of the things that people are doing with Instagram posts and so forth. So I thought it would be fun to have this journey. And then it would also challenge me to lose weight that I want to lose, but it would also
Mhm.
challenge me to interact more with social media and just learn more about how to operate in that space. So it's kind of twofold, but yeah, that's just kind of what I'm up to. I just started, so
Mhm.
it's not gone too far down the road. So we'll see what develops.
Yeah, well, hopefully some of our listeners from this space will kind of jump on that bandwagon with you. Built-in accountability partners, you can't beat it.
Yep, absolutely. All right, man. Well, let's just jump into this data collection, this personal data collection. And so, as I mentioned, we're not going to be talking about what's coming out of your laptops and your desktops. So we're talking about how, most people treat failure. So if you have a setback, you have a failure, people will look at that and they will internalize to the point where it becomes part of their identity, right? They internalize it so much that they made this mistake and it's like it becomes part of their identity and they start to shame themselves because of how they feel about this setback or this failure or this perceived failure. And so what we're going to be talking about today is bouncing back from that.
Gotcha. Gotcha. It's been a running theme in some of our
Mhm.
conversations, Nuge, where we've talked about failure and how we can leverage it as a data point. And when it comes down to it, a lot of us are just sitting on top of a whole lot of data that we've accumulated all over the years because guess what? A lot of times we fail more than we succeed, but we just don't talk about it. We try to brush that under the rug or let the light of victory outshine what we view as the darkness of the failures so that we can forget about them. But that's a lot of good information that we could be learning from and growing from if we were to just sit down for a second, pause, and break down what happened and learn something from those failures. Leverage them like the data points that they are.
You are exactly right. And the pause, I'm glad you mentioned that, is very important because when you have these situations where you make a mistake and you feel like you failed, I think the one thing to try to hold on to is that you're not a failure. You're not a failure. You're just learning some things, and your idea or your process, the hypothesis of what you were trying to do was wrong or it was off. But it really doesn't. It really doesn't say anything about who you are as an individual. You just made a wrong calculation. And now, as you mentioned, now you have the data in order to review and try to fix it.
Absolutely. But there's a big obstacle that gets in the way of us being able to do that. And that's the big old fat ego that all of us have. And to a certain degree can be our alter ego that holds us back. When that ego gets in the way, it can keep us from taking advantage of that data. And that ego is groomed. Us from a young age, we're groomed to be loss averse, right? You think about the things that we experience as kids, before I even get to that, I just think about Talladega Nights. I've referenced Talladega Nights before on the podcast, and
Yes, you have.
Ricky Bobby was sitting there saying, "Hey, second place is first loser." And
Yeah.
that mentality is ingrained in us from the beginning. You think about field day, that was one of my favorite times in elementary school, field day, when you would get out there, you'd have little competitions and what happened? The people that won got ribbons and they got celebrated and all that other stuff. You think about being on the playground, people getting picked last. Nowadays they don't even let them pick teams anymore because they don't want anybody to feel like they get picked last. But that notion of getting picked last on the playground. So it may not even necessarily be that we were explicitly told that failure was bad, but such a high premium was placed on winning that that just by virtue of that, failure became the worst option possible.
Yeah, dude, you talk about getting picked on the playground. I had a rough go because I was the smallest kid on the block, man. And
Yeah.
folks they didn't look at my ability. They just looked at my stature. And they said, no, we want somebody who's big and buff. And it didn't matter whether it was football or basketball or whatever it was.
Mhm.
They wanted the biggest guys on the block. So yeah, I had a rough go with that. But the thing about this whole failure concept and the data collection is that if you think about it, when you think about some of the most successful people in the world that you can think of and where they are now, right? You don't always see the journey that it took for them to get there. And they don't look at failure as the end. It's
Mhm.
over. I mean, I think if everybody who is successful, and I'm talking about, let's just call it everyday successful to, the very outer space successful, the people who are billionaires and so forth, because I think there's different degrees of that. But if you stopped at every time that you failed at something or that you made a mistake, then you don't ever really get to see how great you can actually be. You don't ever get to see the potential. You don't ever get to see the dream that you have had and that you've carried for however long materialize.
Giving up when we encounter a failure is how we reinforce and cement the walls of our comfort zone. And we've talked about that ad nauseum here about how the comfort zone it's nice and warm and it's snug,
Um,
but man, is it a trap that prevents you from growing. And when we encounter a failure and we just throw our hands up and say, nope, can't do this, we've laid the strongest foundation possible for that particular wall of our comfort zone. And we're setting ourselves up to be stuck.
yeah, and stuck is an uncomfortable place. Unfortunately, we don't realize it right away when we get there. Um, so when we talk about not getting into this whole failure and uh, really self sabotage um mindset that we can't, do anything or we are not, worthy of our goals and dreams. And I think that that's where that shame comes in and keeps us, from that growth. But, one of the things in our research here was that there was a scientist named Dr. Carol, I think is Dewick. Hopefully I said that right, from the University of Stanford. She talked about fixed mindset and growth mindset.
Oh, yes.
And I got a feeling you have a few things to share with us on those two topics, Frankie.
Absolutely. So, one of the things I do in my volunteer time is I coach youth sports. And there is no better laboratory for seeing these things on display than how kids react in youth sports. So I tell my sons and my teams that I coach all the time is that you're going to learn and grow more from a loss than you will from a win.
That's hard for people to hear, isn't it?
Very. Oh man, is it hard for them to hear. But we win a couple of games, when things are going well, morale is high, but then when that first loss comes, it's just like it all just gets blown up, right? So that fixed mindset takes hold right away. But then I always try to focus on it, the immediate practice following that. We really start to break it down, try to digest what we learned, not turn it into a finger pointing session, but all right, what did we learn? What can we do to avoid this next time? And when you frame it like that, it seems to be a lot less risk involved. If we try to take the same approach in our lives towards a growth mindset, it's like, okay, yes, we're going to encounter a failure. We might be upset about that failure. We got to deal with our emotions first, but then we got to be able to take a look and see what we can glean from it so we can grow. And with that in mind, I'll throw this back to you. To be able to embrace a growth mindset, it really feels like you have to be secure in who you are to be able to really embrace a growth mindset. What do you think about that?
I think that's accurate, because when you think about a fixed mindset, basically what that says is that, through failure and struggle, you have the inability to grow, or you
Mm,
feel like you have the inability to grow. But in a growth mindset, you have this thought or you have this feeling that you have unlimited growth potential.
Mhm.
And I think in order to have that feeling of unlimited growth potential, you have to have some level of knowing yourself. You have to know who you are in order to really exercise that thought that there is unlimited growth potential, that you have unlimited growth potential. You have to believe it. If you don't believe it, then I think your growth potential severely diminishes.
I can get with that. Also, too, I think an impact on whether or not we're able to embrace the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset wh- on a failure by failure basis, because I think that mindset
Mm,
isn't concrete all the time. I think it depends on the failure, right? And I think a big part of that is who's watching
mm,
when the failure happens. I think that's a big part
yes.
that we have to take into consideration too.
Yeah, because, you never really want to fail. And I think that as we talked about, as you mentioned earlier, growing up, you want to be picked, right? You want to be
Mhm.
picked to be on the team, but you don't want to let the team down, right? And so, yeah, everybody is watching. But when you think about failure and you think about growth, I mean, think about your GPS, right? Driving up the
Mhm.
road, you're going on this long trip, and you make a wrong turn, and the GPS doesn't say, "Oh, dude, you dummy. You made a left, you should have made a right," right? All it does is it just basically says recalculating, right?
Mhm.
It
Right.
doesn't even say it doesn't even ask me if I wanted to recalculate half the time. It just says it's going to recalculate the route to make sure that you get to the end goal, right? And so I think that we have to put ourselves in that same, metaphor, because those mistakes, those errors, those failures, they're going to come. But
Mhm.
the question is, how are you going to deal with them when they do come? Because it doesn't speak about you as an individual. It doesn't speak to your character. You just made a mistake. Now, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I will, sidebar, I will post a counter to your GPS analogy, this GPS metaphor. That recalculating thing is true, unless you might be one of those folks that's purchased one of those custom voice packs for your GPS. I was riding with a former colleague on a business trip. He had his phone plugged in and we were using the GPS, and he had purchased the Arnold Schwarzenegger voice pack for his GPS, and he missed the exit. It's like, exit now. What are you doing, stupid? Exit now. So I will say it depends on how snarky your GPS voice pack is.
Wow. Who would have thought that you could, pay for abuse out of your GPS? So let's talk about the language of failure that leads
Mhm.
to this data collection. In a previous episode we talked about apologizing and the difference between I'm sorry versus I apologize, and some of the connotations that comes with. And I think the same is true here when we talk about making mistakes or failing. Do we tell ourselves that we failed, or do we tell ourselves that the attempt at whatever we were doing failed? What do you think about that?
We have to be objective, right? And dealing with failure is a prickly situation, because a lot of times failure feels very personal, but we still have to maintain our
Oh,
objectivity.
failure is personal, sir. I will tell you that.
As personal as it may be, once we've processed our emotions, we have to be able to look at it objectively. What data can I glean from this? But yeah, the words matter, because we referenced this before when we were in our habits episode talking about identity, and our identity has a huge impact on our outcomes. So in the analogy
Mhm.
that you just gave, if I say I failed, then I'm internalizing and identifying myself as a failure, versus the attempt failed. Then, that was the attempt. And then, hey, I got another go. I can try this again. The analogy we used when we were talking about habits was saying, I want to be someone who I want to run more, versus saying I'm a runner. When we own that identity of being a runner, that levels up our possibility for success, for the successful outcomes. So I think the converse of that is true when we identify and internalize this notion of being a failure.
Yeah, and I'm just making a note here because I think that we just stumbled on something that we can probably talk about at some point, and we're talking about language. And so it came up, like I said, in the apology episode. Now it's coming up here in the difference between I failed versus, the attempt failed. And I just think about some of the things that we tell ourselves on a daily basis that really align with this type of conversation. Because as you said, words matter. And, what we tell ourselves, we internalize a lot of different things
Oh,
all
yes.
day long. So that's probably something that we should explore in a future episode.
So before
So
we
let's
move
get
away
back
from
on.
yeah, before we move away from that topic, with the identity, I'll just share an observation. I work in higher education. And one of the things I see in higher education is students having to deal with this internalization of failure because you've got a lot of students that come into the college scene who have never made anything less than an A in their entire
Mm,
lives. And then once they get to college and they take that organic chemistry course or that physics course or, some other course and they see a failing grade on a test, or they get a C or something like that, that's almost cause for meltdown because they've been so used to that success that they can't deal with the failure and they just immediately internalize it.
yeah, because I think, people identify themselves with the fact that they have been so successful for
Mhm.
so long. And then that one misstep, hopefully it's only one or two, but nothing ginormous, but it does. It could just put you in a tailspin. Yeah. So we talked about the mistakes and the failures. So let's talk about how we assess this whole thing, right? How do we assess where we are? How do we get to the data that we need to use in order to catapult us forward and help us to reach the goals that we want to reach?
Well, spoiler alert, this is where the pause is pivotal in driving forward to a positive outcome. We have to take a moment to take a look at what happened. So many times we are motivated because the failure is uncomfortable. Failure hurts. And like you said, the failure is deeply personal. Many times we want to just try to move past it and forget about it and not have to look at it again because it was so uncomfortable. But in that pause, we'd have to lean in. It's like we always say, if we want to grow, we've got to be a little uncomfortable. And we have to take an uncomfortable, objective look at what went on so that we can figure out what to do next. But I think there's some steps that we could break this thing down into to give folks a little bit of a rubric to navigate that because that's a very emotionally charged time for us when we're
Oh,
assessing a failure. So
absolutely.
having some steps to follow will be immensely helpful.
Absolutely. And the first step I think is not falling into the shame spiral
Mm,
because you made this mistake and you internalize it, which is partly the introspection of what happened, but not wallowing in that space, internalizing to the point that you are so shameful that you don't want to move forward in trying to reach your goal. And I think it is very easy in order to do that, especially if you're in a situation where that you've had a succession of things that have not gone well for you. Um, and I think that that's where the accountability partner comes in, and the village that we talk about to kind of
yeah.
help you from falling down into the muck of the shame spiral. So I think that's the first thing that we need to look at.
So with that, the shame spiral, because that feels like such a slippery slope. How do you think the shame spiral is impacted, accelerated by our current microwave culture? We talked about that before, where we got this microwave culture where everything's got to be instant gratification, got to have it right now. How do you think this microwave culture, coupled with the speed at which information spreads, how do you think that impacts the shame spiral?
I think it impacts it greatly because, as you mentioned, the speed of how information travels nowadays, people want to keep up. People don't want to get left behind. They want to feel like they are lesser than the person next to them that may be accelerating at a faster rate. So I think it's hugely impactful. But I think the thing is that the shame spiral, I think you can cut it off quicker if, as we mentioned earlier, you have a strong sense of who you are. And if you're struggling in that area, I think the shame spiral, um, as we talked about the wrestling analogies, it can get the death grip on you. Um, and so I think having a strong sense of who you are kind of helps with that.
Mhm.
And then, being able to determine some of the information that's coming out, if it's because there's so much coming out and so many different angles, being able to determine what's real, what's reality, um, versus just noise.
Yeah. And what I was thinking of in that space was back in the day, if I was at the gym, back in my younger years, if I was at the gym and we were hooping, we were playing ball, and I got dunked on, or I got my shot blocked, or somebody broke my ankles because they hit me with a killer crossover. The only people that saw that were the people that are there in the gym. But now, with the advent of social media, you got people that are recording, boom, boom, boom. Before you can get your butt up off the floor, somebody's already posted that video of your failure or whatever happened, your mistake, and it's traveling around the world at light speed.
Okay,
That's
so
what.
you're talking about optics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's real.
Mhm.
That is real because as soon as we post this episode, it's out there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
once it hits the internet, it is never going away.
Yeah. Well, the next step in maybe this ties into what you were saying is the blame. You know, um, who is to blame for that failure?
Oh man, that's some choppy water to sail, because in our emotional response to the failure, it's very easy for us to try to point the finger to external sources. And that's comforting because it reinforces our identity of being successful. If we can point the reason for the failure outside of ourselves, that protects our sense of self if we think we're, a successful person. That's where that ego is trying to protect itself. But instead of having that mindset of attribution, where we try to attribute the failure to something outside of ourselves, we need to look at it from the context of contribution. What did I do to contribute to this mistake, this failure that happened? And what can I do in the future to avoid it and prevent it from repeating?
Yeah, because if you deflect the the blame, if you will, if you deflect the ownership of what actually happened, really the bottom line is, what do you learn?
Right.
I mean, that's part of the data collection. So what do you learn if you don't own the failure or the mistake or the accident, however you want to frame it? If you don't own it, you don't learn anything from it. When you're doing this analysis, when you're doing this assessment, you have nothing to work with.
Yeah. If you can explain away the fact that all the problems came from outside of yourself, there's nothing for you to change within yourself, or your perception is that there's nothing for you to change within yourself. So guess what? You're going to do the same thing again,
Again,
and you're going to get the same result.
that's right. And that brings us, sir, to something called premature quitting.
Whew. Talk
Giving
about
up
it.
because you think the first negative data point or the first mistake or the first failure is the final conclusion. That is your curtain call.
I'm shaking my head because raising two young men, this is always, part of the discussion when a failure is encountered. Not calling them quitters. Like, all right, well, what are you going to do? You got to do something. What are you going to do? Or when I was coaching kids, the first thing they want to do is they want to quit. Somebody's used to being good at everything that they do. And then when they encounter something that's difficult, oh, this is terrible. I don't like this. I'm not going to do it anymore because I'm not good at it. But yeah, quitting early, premature quitting, giving up just means that, again, we're putting another nail, another piece of rebar and concrete into the foundation of the walls of our comfort zone trap. And we're preparing ourselves for stagnation.
Yeah, I think looking at the failure, looking at the mistake is more of a variable. It's not a verdict. It's not who you are. It's just something that happened that you need
Hmm.
to, work through,
Right.
something that you have to work through for yourself, to get to the other side. And so that being said, so now as we look at, how do we put this data together, right? Like, what steps do we take to actually get to the, to get to the part of the data that we can, review and do something with, right? To move forward.
Uh-huh.
So, we've done the analysis. or I guess maybe this is part of that analysis, but what are the steps and how we analyze that data to get to a better goal or a better outcome?
You alluded to it at the top of the conversation, the scientific nature, people in science, that when they do an experiments, they do certain things. Well, what we're talking about is really the core principle, the core tenet of the scientific method, where, first we make a hypothesis, then we test that hypothesis, we analyze the results, and then we draw conclusions and make next steps. Now, I think we can break, in terms of breaking it down for personal failures, we don't have to do all those steps of the scientific method, but I think we can break it down into 3 or 4 steps. And I think the first piece is the hypothesis, and that's a tongue twister word that may not be familiar, but it's effectively a theory. It's like, okay, based on what I know, this is what I think is going to happen. When I do this, this is the result that I expect. You don't know until you test, but the hypothesis is your first foray into what you think the outcome is going to be.
So you basically have to, when we're talking about this, identifying how to break this failure down, we have to first know what we were trying to do in the first place, is
Right.
what you're saying.
We have to
We have
know
to know
what was
we
the hypothesis.
Yeah, what we were trying to do in the first place. And and not only what were we trying to do, but what did we think the outcome was going to be, right?
Mm.
So, okay, so now we've done that, right? We figured this out. We know what we were trying to do. We knew what we were looking to achieve. What's next?
So let's assume we've done the thing and we've got the result, and the result was a failure. Right. Well, a
Mhm.
failure is a result. There's data to be uncovered there. So in that failure, in that result that we got, we actually have the second step is to find the variable. Like, what was the
Mhm.
thing that led to the failure? What is something that I can tweak the next time I try this to get a different outcome?
Yeah, what thing can we tweak? But also, did we follow the intended plan? Because
Mm,
sometimes, you step off track a little bit and think that it's not going to really make a difference. And I think that sometimes that can really affect your outcome as well.
absolutely. Absolutely. And, we talk about the things we can tweak. We think about things about, the amount of effort we put forth,
Time.
how much time, what was our strategy, communication. So out of those 4 things, dude, time, effort, strategy, communication, what would you think is the largest contributing factor to a failure?
I would say effort.
Okay.
I would say effort, because you may have the time and you may have a good strategy, and you may or may not need to communicate that to anyone but yourself. And so, if I'm owning this failure, this process, I think one of the first things I'm gonna look at is, did I put in the effort in order to make it successful? And sometimes you're gonna put in the effort. Sometimes you will say 100% that you have put in the effort, but maybe one of the other parts um, is where the process broke down. So I don't want anybody to think that just because I said effort first, that I'm saying that your effort is always going to be case. It's not.
Right. Right.
It's not always going to be a case. But I definitely want to know, if I'm owning this, that I put forth the effort that I felt was needed in order to be successful.
Yeah. And I like how you touched on the situational nature of it, right? It's not always going to be effort. Well, when I was looking at this, I looked at some data from the Project Management Institute. It was talking about projects, just generally speaking. And when we're trying to navigate a comeback, when we're trying to deal with a failure, that's a personal project. So the Project Management Institute identified communication as the primary reason that projects fail. They said that in over half of projects that fail, communication was the reason for the breakdown. And, if no man is an island. We've said that before. No person is an island. We've got to have interactions with the outside world. If we can't effectively communicate what we're trying to accomplish, then our likelihood of success gets diminished quite considerably.
Yeah, and I think that's true even on a personal level, even for entrepreneurs. I mean, you have some, I'll call them garage operators that just, one person by themselves. But
Yeah.
at some point, you are going to have to communicate somewhere in order to get that goal to move that project to the end goal. So I can see where communication would be right up there, but I definitely want to know if I'm if I've done my part,
Right.
especially if I'm owning it. So
Absolutely.
a- And then after that, so now, we got the variables, we figured that out. And then now the time is to retest it, right?
Right. You figured out a variable, make an adjustment to that variable that you identified, and test your hypothesis again. So rerun the experiment, see what happened, see if the tweak or the change that you made to the variable had a positive or negative impact on the outcome. And then guess what? Rinse and repeat.
Yeah. Because that third run, I mean, it may not be perfect, right?
Mhm.
You may not hit the exact goal on the first or second or third run, but at least you have improved at every step or at every phase of the process.
Yeah. Continuous improvement. That's, these 3 steps that we outlined reminds me very much of something called the PDCA cycle. And we've made mention of it very early on in the podcast. So PDCA, excuse me, plan, do, check, adjust. This was originally, mentality, a little framework created for fighter pilots back in the day, but it's at the core of the continuous improvement culture in industry, and it applies to us as individuals as well. So plan, you make your hypothesis, do, you execute, check, you analyze the results that you got, adjust based on what you found out, do something different, and rerun. They call it a cycle because you go back through again.
Maybe we can put that in the notes of this episode so folks can remember that.
Absolutely.
All right. So now that we have gone through the entire process here, one of the things I just want to remind everybody is that you are not a failure.
Right.
And I think everyone can take note of that and just stop telling yourself that you are a failure. Stop telling yourself negative things, right? Because that does play on you. It plays on your consciousness, and you just internalize those things. If you hear them all the time, and if you're the one saying them all the time, then I think it's a little bit easier for you to start believing. And it's really not true. I don't think there are any failures out there. You just have bad data, right? You just have bad data. You're not a failure. You just have bad data.
And I wouldn't even classify it as bad data. That data doesn't care. That data doesn't have an opinion. It's just data. We think about how businesses run. Businesses collect a lot of information, and then based on that data, they make decisions. They make tweaks. Like, at the top of the conversation, we were talking about Walmart's, demonic dynamic pricing. That was a data-based decision, a data-based decision that they came to. So in our personal lives, we need to be about our business and look at that data as if, our life is our business, because guess what? It is. And we need to stand on business when it's time for us to assess where we've had missteps and find ways to make it a little bit better next time. Incrementally and continuously improve by making small adjustments.
All right. Well, we'll be interested to hear what you, our audience, thinks about this conversation. Leave us some comments about whether or not you're ready to stop treating failures as, verdicts, or internalizing them to the point where, you think that they are part of your identity, and just using them, as we've said, as data points to improve your outcomes. So I think, Frankie, this has been a very good conversation from my vantage point, very enlightening. I always learn a few things from having a conversation with you, sir. So I appreciate that, and I hope our audience has also learned a few things as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Nuge. It's always good to just sit here and chop it up, as the young folks like to say. Try to just share a little bit of positivity, and because guess what? I failed more than I've won. And if I let those failures define me, I would be a sad sight to behold. So if I can share a little bit, and you can share a little bit with everybody that's out there to help them avoid that trap, then I think we've done something positive.
We really do appreciate you taking this journey with us. We appreciate your comments on the social spaces. And we're starting to get a few more of those, which is much appreciated. And we're getting a few more followers, which is much appreciated. So we want to keep that momentum and invite you to keep doing that. And for those of you who are here for the first time, we invite you to go out there and, follow us as well. And so with that said, Frankie, I always turn it over to you to let everybody know exactly where they can find us in the social spaces.
Well, come get us. So for everything PSI Effect podcast related, go to our website. This is psipod.com. There you will find a listing of all of our episodes and a listing of all the aggregators, all the podcast platforms where you can subscribe to the audio version of our podcast. Be sure to find your favorite podcast platform and subscribe today so you don't miss any episodes of when Nuge and I drop new content. Also, we we post video of every episode on YouTube. You can search for the PSI Effect podcast or use our handle at This Is PSI Pod to find us on YouTube. And that same handle is our social media handle. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at This Is PSI Pod. We look forward to seeing you out there in the digital spaces.
All right. Thank you, Frankie, for that. Really appreciate that. And so to you, our audience, just want to remind you that setbacks are temporary and comebacks are legendary. And until next time, go out there and be brave and rise on purpose.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the PSI Effect podcast. This show doesn't happen without you, and you can connect with us via Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit our website at thisispsipod.com and find us on YouTube and social media at This Is PSI Pod. That's at This Is PSI Pod. Until next time, remember, be brave and rise on purpose.